Cognitive science and philosophy often treat the I and the other as static, independent entities, fixed points of reference that exist before interaction begins. Searching for a localized seat of consciousness or a specific anatomical module for the self leads into a metaphysical trap. Continuity theory and the Brain Kinematics Model provide a strictly organizational framework to replace those static assumptions. Under BKM, the I functions as an emergent organizational process, one that the brain must continuously reconstruct to maintain a coherent reference frame. The other emerges as a cognitive necessity the moment the I defines its own organizational boundary. This framework proposes that consciousness arises from the dynamic, shifting equilibrium between these two organizational poles. To understand the self, we have to look past physical structures and track a continuous verb, how a biological system organizes itself against the environment from the ground up. Primitive organisms possess no explicit self-awareness. Their existence is defined by a single directive, regulating internal chemical and energetic stability to prevent environmental dispersion. This diagram represents that baseline regulation. Every organized unit possesses a balancing axis. This axis acts as an organizational center. It minimizes destructive dispersion while it simultaneously permits necessary adaptive change. As nervous systems evolved, they began integrating perception, memory, and action into this fundamental regulatory loop. Selfhood begins as a mechanical homeostatic necessity, a tool for surviving a chaotic environment. This integration of sensory and memory data forces the nervous system to create a unified internal reference frame. The system uses this frame to distinguish self-generated physiological events from external environmental stimuli. We define this specific, bounded reference frame as the I. As complexity scales, the I represents the system's progressively increasing awareness and regulation of its own balancing axis. The I exists as the system's internal, continuously updated map of its own stability. Once this boundary is established, any foreign data input requires classification. The system classifies incoming data by mirroring its own structure, generating a conceptual not me to measure the input against. The other consists of organizations that the brain recognizes as being centered on a different balancing axis than its own. We process the real other, physically existing entities and environments, through direct sensory perception. The brain also constructs the virtual other, an internal entity built from memory, future simulations, and abstract symbols. This capacity for virtual others enables internal dialogue. It turns high-level reasoning into a simulated conversation between different organizational viewpoints. Interactions between the I and the other exist on a spectrum called the challenge continuum. Consider the micro-adjustments required when two pedestrians walk down a sidewalk. Both agents act to preserve their own regulatory trajectories and spatial boundaries. If both people step in the same direction, prediction uncertainty increases, creating immediate cognitive load. Under continuity theory, stress serves as a signal of regulatory challenge rather than an inherent pathology. At the low end of the continuum, minimal challenge leads to routine and limited adaptation. Moderate challenge promotes optimal learning, attention, and cognitive growth. Excessive challenge forces defensive reorganization, anxiety, or aggression. Following the interaction, the brain performs a recursive internal evaluation, or self-reflection. This reflection structurally updates the internal model of the I, minimizing future prediction errors. Friction with the other provides the mechanical engine that forces the self to evolve. This biological architecture mirrors the developmental hierarchies described across disparate philosophical and religious traditions. Psychological models often map a progression from instinctive regulation toward a more integrated self. Humanistic models describe a similar climb from survival toward self-actualization. Philosophical systems chart the rational development of self-recognition through history. Many spiritual paths, from Sufism to Buddhism, describe a hierarchical refinement of awareness and a shedding of rigid boundaries. Continuity theory identifies a common pattern across these systems: the movement toward increasingly integrated and comprehensive forms of organization around a central balancing axis. In the physical reality of the brain, these high-level phenomena are driven by continuous neural strain flows and synchronized phase waves. Because the self is never permanently stored in fixed tissue, It must be continually regenerated by these dynamic organizations. Consciousness manifests as the dynamic equilibrium produced by the continuous interaction between the I and the other. Without the predictive friction provided by the other, the I would lack the necessary pressure to maintain its own structural coherence. The history of a conscious mind is the history of a relentless, evolving dialogue between the self and the universe it was forced to invent.